All right, so moving on to fallacies. If you don't know already what a fallacy is, is an argument or is a flaw in your argumentation. Whether this be a flaw of, um, you know, the structure of the argument itself, in the presentation of a particular point, or like in the very nature of arguing, or if it be a matter of avoiding your opponent's point, right? By attacking them or attacking their position rather than developing your own. These are all various flaws in how you can in arguing, and there can be overlap between some of them. All right, so we'll start with fallacies of argument, right? Which are those that have to do with the argument itself. Right? So arguments that make these fallacies cannot be valid or sound because they are faulty in their very nature. Right? What you're doing is not making an argument, in fact, if you make one of these fallacies. Right? You're doing something else, right? You're naysaying or you know, leading someone around. You're engaging in pure rhetoric rather than in argumentation. So some of these fallacies include mere assertion, right? Begging the question, vicious circle, irrelevancies, and slippery slope. So in the case of mere assertion, what this is, it's what you do, it's basically what an argument is between a couple of toddlers, arguing that you're right just because you accept the position, right? It's my turn to share. It's my turn to have the, toy. Mommy says it's important to share. Well, my mommy says I don't have to. Yes, you do. No, I don't. Yes, you do. No, I don't. Right? That's not really an argument. It's throwing a temper tantrum at each other, right? In that case, when you have two people who are just making a mere assertion. Why is it important to share? It just is, because I say so, right? Because I said so. Right? The classic parenting line is a fallacy. Another example would be begging the question, right? Where an argument accepts as a premise the very conclusion it's meant to argue. Right? So this isn't the same as like stating what you're trying to conclude or how how this conclusion is sort of drawn out by something you've already said, earlier in the paper, or doing it in the middle of your argument, right? It's explicitly saying that my conclusion is also one of my premises. The very point I'm trying to argue is the point that I'm just putting forward now, right? So what you do is you kind of beg the question, right? You create sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, right? That, oh, well, because it's true, because I argue that this particular point is true, that makes it as the conclusion also true. But that's not how that really works. That's not how argumentation works, right? You have points that lead toward a conclusion. The conclusion cannot itself be one of those points. That's begging the question. You also have vicious circle, where you use two propositions or 2 points of your argument to support one another without additional outside support. So what you've essentially done is you've just leaned them against each other and put the weight of your argument on top of them, right? They're not actually supported by anything else. There's no ground supporting them. They're just mutually supporting each other, right? Without any further evidence or proof or, validation for those individual points, right? Classic example of this is you see if you've ever had the misfortune of like being a juror, you know this, right? I've been a juror 3 times, and every time there's at least one person who makes this argument, right? Well, he must be guilty because he's got a guilty look on his face. Well, how do we know that it's a guilty look? Well, I can tell it's a guilty look because he's the one who's guilty. But how do we know he's guilty? Well, because he's got a guilty look on his face. How do you know it's a guilty look? Because he's guilty. Right? See how it goes? There's nothing that really supports either one except the other. Right? Either proposition except the other. Then we have what are called irrelevancies. These are going to be arguing by including things that do not matter to the point you intend to make. Right? I wouldn't say tangents because tangents can still be relevant, but think of a conversation you've had with someone where they're going along with a particular story, right? There's a clear thread of thought, of narrative throughout, and then suddenly they jump to something completely unrelated, and they continue on with that, and then they jump back to the end of their story, right? That whole other thread that had nothing to do with the original story suddenly is treated as though it's important to it. That's what arguing with irrelevancies are, right? It's putting forward pointless information as though it's important, right? And then finally, you have what are called the slippery slope. One of politicians, you know, one of pretty much every politician's favorite form of uh, rhetoric. Right? You see this especially amongst conservatives, right? Where you argue that if A happens, then B, C, D, so on and so forth will follow until you get to some undesirable result, Z. Right? Um, think of it as the snowball effect, right? Well, if we let them legislate for stricter gun control, then then the police won't be armed, and then riots will break out in the city, and then the whole of America will become a dystopian nightmare from the road. Right? It's just take the idea that if you take one step in one direction, something horrible is going to happen, right? Just inevitably through this chain of events that's not logically explained how they're connected. If you can logically explain a probable connection between one or each link in the chain of events, then it's not a slippery slope. But if you just assert that it's going to happen, then it is a slippery slope, and that is a fallacy. Because you're not making an argument at that point. You're just expressing fears.